Satchel, Paige by Lisa Klein Ransom. Some say Leroy was born 6 feet 3.5 inches tall, 180 pounds, wearing a size 14 shoe. Not a bit of truth to it. As some argue that when Miss Lula Paige first held her precious Leroy in her arms, she noticed his right fist was tightly curled around a baseball. Pure fiction. It would take him 18 years to grow to that size and about half that amount of time to realize that his hand and a baseball were a perfect match. He knew from early on he had a gift for throwing. His mom, Lula, knew it too. When she needed a plump chicken for the evening supper, she'd send her Leroy to do the fetching. His arm, so strong and lean, was as swift and sure as any rifle. With a rock he could knock a chicken or almost anything else out with one shot. By the time Leroy was 10, he could outthrow anyone, small or grown. He spent all his free time practicing, and it showed. He pitched a shutout game the first time he stepped onto the mound as pitcher for the W.H. Council School team in Mobile, Alabama. Folks would talk about that Paige boy over on the south side long after the game had ended. Even with baseball keeping him as busy as it did, earning money was always on young Leroy's mind. As the seventh of 12 Paige children, he understood he had to do his part to put food on the table. Leroy knew that the pennies earned from his bottle collecting wouldn't be enough to help support his family, so he headed out to the depot where he'd heard some real money could be made. At the depot, Leroy's pennies soon turned into shiny dimes, tossed from the hands of passengers returning to Mobile from faraway places like Chicago, Baltimore, and New Orleans. He was always the first and fastest to offer his toting services. And when he began to hang a half dozen or so satchels on a long stick that he draped over his shoulder, his friends told him he'd look just like a walking satchel tree. Somehow the name Satchel just stuck. When dimes weren't enough, Leroy took to stealing. And when he could no longer run fast enough, it was stealing that caught him. Shortly after Leroy's 12th birthday, he was sent off to a place far beyond rural roads and depot dimes. Life at the Mount Meigs Industrial School for Negro children was difficult for most, but not for Satchel. He was surprised at how good a hard, honest day's work could make him feel. And the best thing about reform school, aside from the 3 meals a day and a pair of shoes, was the baseball team. He'd certainly played his share of games with his buddies back on the streets of Mobile, but, you see, they were nothing like this. Real leather balls, not the ones your mama made with a rock and a rag, and real wooden bats, too. After seeing him try out for the school team, the coach at Mount Meigs kept his eye on young Satchel and taught him the difference between throwing and pitching. You concentrate on baseball, he told Satchel, and you might make something of yourself. Satchel kept right on pitching up until 1923, the year he returned to his family's little house on Bascom Street. He'd been gone 6 years, but he still knew what it meant when his mom told him, "We got mouths to feed." There weren't many career choices for blacks in the segregated South, and not one of those choices appealed to Satch. Besides, baseball was all he knew. He made his way over to the stadium where his big brother Wilson Paddlefoot Paige was playing for the black semi-pro team, the Mobile Tigers, and he talked the coach into letting him try out. 10 pitches and 10 strikes later, he was their new starting pitcher. The pay was small and the crowds even smaller, but it was baseball, plain and simple. After just a few games, Satch became so sure of his pitching, he'd bet anyone who'd listen he could knock 10 bottles off a wall or throw 10 straight pitches over a hanky. The extra money he made from winning bets wasn't much, but it was more than a dime a satchel and more than he'd ever had before. As a semi-pro pitcher, Satchel developed his own unique style. He'd pick up a tip here and there, but put his Satchel spin on it and polish it off with a brand new name. Got so Satch began to think of his pitchers as his children. The hesitation was his magic slow ball. The trouble ball caused all sorts of havoc. And then there was the b-ball, which, according to Satch, would always be where I want it to be. There was an odd way about his pitching. He would stand tall and straight as an oak tree on the mound. His foot looked to be about a mile long, and when he shot it in the air, it seemed to block out the sun. Satch's arms seemed to stretch on forever, winding, bending, twisting. And then there was that grin he flashed just as he released the ball. It seemed to say, "Go ahead, just try and get a hit off that." Strike one, and you never saw it coming. I mean, 1 minute it was there, plain as day in his hand, and then, all of a sudden, strike two. It was in the catcher's mitt. The batter would strain his eyes, squint a little. Here it comes. Got it now. Strike three. Just like that, all over. Next batter up. Give it to him, Satch. Show your stuff, fans and teammates would shout. And he did, every time. Folks would pack the stands to see how many Satchels could strike out in one game. He made the crowds laugh with his fast talking and slow walking. A man's got to go slow to go long and far, he'd say. But mostly he made them cheer. Never in his 19 years had he heard a sweeter sound. The more cheers he heard, the more his confidence grew. A kind of confidence that made him call to the outfield with bases loaded and the hitter up to bat. "Why don't you all have a seat? Won't be needing you this one." Wherever the crowds went, a good paycheck followed, so he made sure to keep them coming. After just 1 year, he was playing in the Negro Major Leagues for the Chattanooga Black Lookouts, and the folks were still cheering and shouting. Give it to him, Satch. Show your stuff. There were 2 major leagues back in 1924 when Satchel was called up. Because the white major league ball clubs wouldn't allow blacks to play in their leagues, blacks had created their own in 1920 and named them the Negro Leagues. The white major league players enjoyed trains, hotels, hot meals, and short seasons. Negro leagues were often refused meals in restaurants and rooms in hotels. They ate on the road and slept where they could, in train depots or on baseball fields. They played 2, sometimes 3 games a day, nearly every day in a season as long as the weather would hold. And when the season ended in America, Satch went right on playing and traveling in other parts of the world. Life in the Negro Leagues suited Satchel. He was a traveling man. One city could never hold him for long. He moved from Alabama, where he played with Birmingham Black Barons, to Tennessee, where he played with the Nashville Elite Giants, and to Pennsylvania, where he played with Pittsburgh Crawfords. From the first breath of spring till the cool rush of fall, he would ride. Sometimes he joined his teammates on rickety old buses, bumping along on back roads studded with potholes so deep players would have to hold on to their seats and stomachs just to keep from spilling into the aisles. But mostly he drove alone, in cars that would take him wherever he wanted to go. The fans would always be waiting in the next town. Their wait could be a long one. He was never much for keeping anyone's time but his own. Once he reached his mid-30s, the joys of traveling began to wear thin for Satchel. He found himself longing for a more settled life and the comforts of a home. In 1941, he finally found it in the warm smile and tender heart of Lahoma Brown. Satch rested his travel-weary legs and happily began his second career as husband and father.